Hello and welcome to another episode of Bits and Bytes Live. My name is Nigel Stephenson. I look after market development for Europe, Middle East and Africa within the VMware Telco business unit. And this is actually the fourth of 4 episodes that we've been running, specifically focusing on sustainability. So in the previous episodes, we talked about reducing emissions in general. We talked about how to use less energy in the context, in particular, of data centers and the RAN environment. And we've also talked about how to use cleaner energy. So where you are using energy, how can you ensure that that is the cleanest energy you can be using? And all of those previous episodes and this one and others you'll be able to find if you search for VMware Telco on YouTube. You'll find a playlist there with all of these on. So in this final of the 4 that we had planned around sustainability, I'm welcoming back Lorcan Burke again. Welcome, Lorcan, our field CTO of RAN. And we're going to talk about non-technical aspects. Now, the title is Institutional Barriers, but we're going to put a bit more of a positive spin on it. It's really about people and process. So what does sustainability mean when we look at the impact on people and process? And just to sort of frame it, I'm not going to go through the different scopes, but we've got these 3 scopes of emissions. Scopes 1 and 2 are really the direct and the most closely but indirect emissions that an organization controls. And I think most of this conversation, Lorcan, we're probably going to be talking about scope 1 and 2. And they might be things like, emissions from running generators for backup, or if you've got a fleet of vehicles, then you may be, if you're not running electric, or even if they are electric, what's the carbon efficiency of the fuel you're putting in, in your vans. Scope 3 is kind of beyond that, is everything else, and that's probably a bigger topic. But within scope 1 and 2, there's a lot of things that we can influence directly as part of the organization we work in, and as part of the organizations we interface to directly upstream and downstream. And that's really, I think, so kicking it off, Lorcan, in terms of people and process, the sort of thing I'm jumping to, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems that to make any progress on this, what you really need is a kind of top-down leadership approach in your organization. What's your thoughts on that? How are you seeing organizations organize themselves? And I suppose, to what extent is it top-down? Is that always the case, or are there other models?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Right? So you see a lot of corporate reporting requirements on emissions occurring. Right? So there's definite growth of accounting standards around how you report and track your emissions, and that tends to have a top-down, if you like, enforcement or control view of the world. But they often the way to get that top-down activity or those overall objectives from a business lined up with things you're actually doing, you can do quite a lot of bottom-up work. So you'll tend to see a lot of pockets of people who care strongly about sustainability or carbon impact. They're often all over the organization. I think helping those individuals find each other, start sharing small success stories, and helping that grow bottom up will very quickly align with the top down approaches we often find. So it doesn't have to be top down; it can be bottom up as well.
And I suppose the interesting point there is, although ultimately there is going to be a top-down approach to it in terms of implementing a plan, in terms of understanding and identifying opportunities and creativity of looking for opportunities to do more with less, as it were, that a lot of that is going to actually be happening within the functional groups, with the folks that are closer to the processes and the products and services that are being developed.
Yeah, very much so, right? So if you think about how do you start creating a way of reducing your carbon emissions, you need to find some way to measure what's going on, then monitoring your ongoing usage, and then starting to control or reduce over time. And often the starting point ends up being people understanding that they can correlate maybe their energy usage as a particular team with the carbon footprint it has. That carbon footprint is not always directly correlated with the energy use, because if you're using more green energy, it's going to have a lower carbon footprint. But at least you can start measuring your energy use. You can start looking at, as we do a lot in data centers, looking at how do you measure the how active those servers are they being used? Do you power them down? Do you put them in reduced energy states? Just start measuring, start monitoring, and then start controlling. And then that aggregate amount of saving, whether it's carbon or electricity, ultimately starts to align with those corporate goals top down.
And we're seeing, I think I'm right in saying, I know personally, I've met a couple of customers where, from an organizational point of view, organizations are starting to appoint individuals, an energy strategist, for example. You're seeing that across the customer base as well?
Yeah, I think there's always been traditionally, particularly in large communication service providers, somebody's responsible for buying energy, right? So whether you're buying energy for large data centers or buying energy for lots of base station sites, that's a lot of contracts that have to be managed. And often, again, the easiest way to start measuring that carbon impact is at least start looking at your electricity bills, looking at the carbon footprint of that electricity you're buying, which is effectively scope 2, and then start correlating that back into an overall carbon bill, if you like. Then once you're doing that, you can then allocate that to different teams or different departments, so that role of that kind of energy officer or somebody who's responsible for that procurement or carbon footprint can really start driving change across the organization, because they're measuring what's going on.
And that last point is quite key as well, because this really is across the organization. So if we look at, we ran an event last week where we were looking at things that we and our hardware partners can do in terms of sustainability for customers. And there's a lot we can achieve across the data center, the network, the RAN. But in essence, that's still only a part of the challenge and the opportunity, right? So having somebody whose responsibility is energy strategy, it's far bigger than any one of those components. It's not necessarily even a technology role. It's not necessarily a technologist, I think, that would necessarily fill that role. It's really trying to look at business process and try and get the best from the different pieces of the business. And then that's where, coming back to what we said at the top there, that sort of grassroots understanding of what can be done in each of those pockets is what's going to support that type of individual, that energy strategist, in moving the business forward. They're not necessarily going to have that expertise, but collectively the expertise exists if you can channel it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, good example. We have a couple of good partners and customers working together. We're looking at how efficiently we're packing workload into the compute infrastructure in the data center, as an example. To do that, we need to have some processes around how you're deploying each domain owners, whether it's IT, core, or RAN, or transport, their workload, looking at the level of risk they're willing to take around maybe packing more efficiently and what the response time might need to be for a big spike in traffic, and then balancing that risk against the reward of a reduced carbon footprint. So to do that, right? That's very hard for somebody to own as an individual in an organization, but they can certainly be enabled to bring people together and help them trade off that risk. And the risk is financial, it's operational, it's business KPIs. So you can't do it on your own. But certainly, what tends to happen is that particular conversation got triggered by, let's measure what's going on in some labs. Those labs aren't used 24/7. Can we, power down or reduce the footprint in some of those labs? And we were able to, without major change, save 7 to 15% of energy being used. Then we can apply that across the broader real estate in the CSP. But it starts with effectively a bottom up. I think I can do something around this. I think it aligns with some corporate goals. How do we get some people working together on that to measure the benefit?
And that's an interesting point. So if we're, as I say, we're looking mainly at what we can do within the organisation or the immediate partners. But if we look upstream, downstream, what are we seeing in terms of in the CSP space? What are we seeing? Because we're vendors, right, to a CSP community. What are we seeing being asked of us that you think is being driven by sustainability initiatives in the CSP today?
I mean, we're a vendor, but we also operate significant compute infrastructure of our own. Right, we have large data centers around the world that we run. So when we buy energy, as an example for that, we buy guarantees of origin. We buy we buy real green energy where we can. Right, so that's an ongoing objective. So we push that requirement onto our suppliers. We then work with a number of data center providers with that zero carbon commit program, where people have committed to drive towards zero carbon by 2030. So we have a large number of data center providers we work with to do that, which includes not just our components in the data centers, but others. And then with the likes of Easy Buy between Deutsche Telekom and Orange, they're starting to put Scope 3 emissions into their RFQs. So RFI, RFQ cycle, you'll start to see people say, what's your direct Scope 1 and 2 for you as a supplier to me, which is my Scope 3. Explain to me how you're driving out your carbon footprint in your Scope 3. Now, for some people, it's easier. For some people, it's harder. Like for software vendors, there's probably more things you can do easier in reducing your carbon footprints than necessarily people who provide hardware, servers, and the like. But all our ecosystem is driving towards reducing that carbon footprint.
It's interesting. We're talking about some of the customer side of things. One of the things that occurred to me, and I suspect a lot of us within VMware when we were looking at the dish rollout, is the way that the ability to automate the provision of a RAN site, for example. And I think at the time, I will put my hand up and say when I heard of that capability, my immediate thinking was, that's great, it's faster, it's low resource, it's more reliable because there's less human intervention, it's automated and so on. What didn't occur to me, but I'm sure occurred to a number of our colleagues in our sustainability unit, was it's also reducing truck rolls, right?
Yep.
That ability to automate, yes, has a business impact in terms of cost and efficiency and time to market and so on, but it also has an impact on the fleet of vehicles that would otherwise potentially be servicing those sites. So as I say, I think there's a lot of creativity that can be applied. I'm not saying we did that to do sustainability, but that was a very good side effect in my mind. I hadn't thought of it. And it just makes me think there are probably lots of examples like that if you think about the products you're delivering and how they're delivered, you could probably look at them through a slightly different lens, and that might give you a different angle on what you might build if you're a manufacturer, or how you might sell services. So I was thinking, for example, on the CSP side of things, there may well be connectivity services or hosting services that are similar but have different carbon footprints. And does the end consumer know that? Do they have the choice of how they purchase a service based on the carbon impact? I think educating the customer to know that in the first instance, maybe even incentivizing customers to go for a more sustainable service. I'm sure that is starting to happen. I know there are operators out there that are now looking to, and in fact regulatory requirements require them to indicate the sort of the emission element of delivering a service to their customers. So it's part of the bill. Now I'm not sure how advanced that is, but I know that's starting to become a requirement, that customers are made aware of the impact of the services that they're buying. So there's lots of creative ways that we can start to think about how to deliver and procure services.
Yeah, and I mean a real example of that, we have joint customers with a number of CSPs, right? So where we're maybe providing SD-WAN services, so software-defined wide area network with some compute at the edge. That's usually supported with connectivity. And in quarterly business reviews with our large multinationals, we see a requirement for a minimum reporting on the carbon footprint of the network they're using, and that's scope 1 to 3 where possible, and that would include the footprint of the compute as well as maybe the wide area network components, whether it's Cisco software components running on a Dell or HP set of hardware. How do I measure the carbon footprint of that? And again, at the moment it tends to be relatively static, but people are looking to try and get that towards more dynamic reporting, so they can pare things down where they're not needing them. Other things that we work together with Amazon as an example, AWS will generally recommend that you reduce the number of EC2s you use, you reduce the number of data backups you have, so deduplicate data. So we work with people like Cohesity around moving data backups around the place at times, maybe where there's minimum carbon footprint for the network, minimum carbon footprint for the compute side. So why do your data backups when it's most carbon intensive? Do it at a time where it's not, and then report on that. Those things can significantly impact the amount of carbon you're using and direct energy. So a lot going on there.
And that reminds me actually, and some perhaps I can ask you just talk a little bit about is the work you're involved with ESB and it's the Dell Innovation Center, which is interesting as well. Again, another creative idea. You sparked my thought because you're talking about the energy supply. Of course, even if you're purchasing in notionally green or clean energy, the carbon footprint of your energy supply is constantly changing. It comes off the grid, right? So it's not guaranteed at any given time to have a level of greenness or cleanliness, if you like. And I think the work you're doing there is interesting because it's actually trying to forward predict times of cleanest energies. Is that right? If you can maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, fundamentally, we've been working with the ESB in Ireland, the main generator, and they have Electric Ireland as a retail consumer electricity supplier, and a bunch of data center owners, where we were sat there with different communities with a common interest in mind, right? So we need to become greener. We need to reduce our energy demands. The grid has got a significant proportion of energy for either comms service providers or data centers. So if we can figure out a way to reduce the energy load at peak, shift it to times where there's maybe more green energy, when we bring everyone together, we find that the generation side is curtailing wind at night. So maybe there's unused energy at nights or times when it's off peak. There's a relatively predictable wind pattern, so that green energy pattern is relatively understood. The trading side of those businesses uses that to advertise and sell guarantees or sell or reprice different data services or energy services. So if we can match that data up, make an API available to the data center providers and ultimately to those end customers or tenants in data centers, can we start deciding to be more dynamic about use of that green energy? So we work together with Dell, with their data centers, our own data centers, the ESB, and some wind farms, and start just sharing that data. So we've got first prototypes of that available, and then we're starting to look at either shifting temporarily, so by time for when we think, like we talked about some data backups. We have some large pharmaceutical companies in Ireland. They do a lot of data backups between manufacturing sites. How do I shift that workload around in time, making sure it actually meets a more green energy profile? So real willingness in pulling it together, but it's not all top down in that case. That's a bit of guerrilla sustainability, right? So we have a bunch of people who know each other. They're like-minded thinkers and they want to get something done. So we're trying it out, and then we bring it back to the business and say we want to scale this. And almost all cases, we found that people want to scale these types of activities. But it started with small conversations with people across multiple industries and just lining up objectives. Yeah. So quite successful.
What it does is examples like that, as it did for me, it kind of inspires people to think about their own particular day in the office.
Exactly. You're not on your own, right? Yeah. It just reminds you to switch things off when you leave. Things don't have to be left on standby. Or do some work when there's more green energy available. It's really possible. We can schedule a lot of these activities, but we've just forgotten. We've assumed energy is abundant and free. Well, it's abundant maybe, but it's not free, and certainly the carbon impact is pretty significant. So we need to do something about those things.
So bring it back. So that's sort of taking the conversation a little bit about working with our partners in the industry or the supply chain, whatever it might be. Bringing it back into the organisation itself. In terms of taking this forward, ultimately, to have a significant impact, there's going to need to be a plan at some level.
Yes.
Hopefully at a corporate level, but there needs to be a plan at some level. So first step of building a plan, typically in this sort of context, is to understand the status quo, understand what's happening now. So what sort of things can people look at from an organization, process, function perspective, in terms of, where should you be looking to try and to understand the current situation, to give yourself that benchmark?
So I think we talked a little bit about, if you like, the concept of an energy officer, at least the team that are buying energy, right? So if you if you understand how energy is being purchased and where it's being purchased, what it's being used for. So just that measurement, at least that's an ongoing proxy for your carbon footprint in some way. So starting with that, I think often people will then, we find things like different teams all of a sudden start getting an electricity bill internally in their own business. Well, that's the start at least of people saying you have a real cost. You should think about it. Not necessarily getting punished or controlled too much about it yet, but at least you need to think about it. And what's interesting, as soon as you start getting those bills internally, people start thinking about reducing them naturally, because it's real OPEX in nearly all cases. Or how do I do something different about that? And then you start seeing usually a groundswell growing of people working together to reduce those energy bills and therefore their carbon footprint.
If we get, and perhaps should have said at the beginning, if it's not clear to folks, I mean, we talk about carbon footprint. I mean, that's really just a normalizing way of understanding emissions, right? So there is actually a formula for any given emission, whether it's whether it's fuel in a vehicle, whether it's electricity generating, whether it's an emission of a cooling gas or a leak or something like that. There is a translation, if you like, to say, well, that's the equivalent of, and that's the process you go to standardize around the carbon footprint, and then you can compare things to say, okay, that is the environmental impact of that activity. So if you look across your operation and you see where the impacts are and you've normalized them, if you like, then the next thing you're going to need to do is to make choices as to what you're going to address first, because we spoke earlier and you said you're not going to switch off your network. It's that would be a great way of reducing your carbon footprint, but it would probably kill the business overnight. So that's obviously not going to happen. So there's decisions to be made about what you move, what you run at a different time, what you maybe reduce capacity on. In order to create the shortlist of what you're going to try and address first, what do you think the parameters are that you're looking at as a business in terms of saying, okay, these are the three things I'm going to do first?
Yeah. So I guess we talked a little bit about measuring. So at least you've got exposed some of the electricity costs on a departmental or domain level, right? So whether it's IT, core, RAN, transport in a CSP, or the B2B business, then you're monitoring it. So some way of ongoing reporting and scheduling some activity, and then you do need to, if you want to reduce, you need to think about the risk associated with that reduction. So there are traffic patterns in all our networks, right? So they might be extended because of fixed network infrastructure delivering residential services in the evening, that it tends to have a longer busy hour, busy day, but there are quiet times in the network. So if we can understand a bit more about those traffic patterns, the level of risk associated with reducing or packing more efficiently the applications into the network, if we do that and we understand how quickly it takes to recover to full load against a spike of traffic, then we can start trying some smaller experiments, figuring out how often those spikes in traffic, if you like, occur, and then measure the carbon efficiency delivered by those changes. So it starts with small things, right? Do it with some labs, do it with small parts of the network, then scale it across the network.
I guess, yeah. Look for in a way, look for the low hanging fruit. Where in this case, the low hanging fruit is a combination of what can I do, what can I do to get the best impact, what's the risk associated with doing it, and then probably other things like is there a potential for a conflict with a business goal? Because I guess if there's a conflict with a business goal, that's probably not a good place to start.
It's probably good. Yeah, exactly.
Aligned, and then make some progress, and then if you've done that benchmarking up front, understanding the status quo, you'll be able to come back and then measure the impact, and then with good luck, as it were, then that cycle starts to repeat. So now you start to build a community, essentially, I guess. Once you show progress, show success, show opportunity to deliver what is effectively probably going to be a business benefit as well as a planet benefit, because invariably this is a cost benefit as well in most cases. Then you can start to build a community in that groundswell and move the organization forward. It's a fascinating area. I think certainly as I've looked into it more and more, the creativity in this space seems to be enormous. There's some of the use cases, some of the ways I've seen documented people finding ways of saving energy, reducing emissions. And I suppose that one of the encouraging things is that actually a lot of what we're seeing doesn't necessarily require new technology. A lot of it is just putting together the technology in slightly different ways, communicating with partners in a way that you might not have done before. A lot of the core technology is actually quite mature, but new ways of thinking about how we apply it, bringing in information from third parties, as you say, like understanding how the weather is going to affect the wind farm, which is going to affect the cleanness of the energy supply. 10 p.m. on Tuesday versus 10 a.m. on Wednesday, moving workloads to run at that time because we could do that in the data set. These things coming together are becoming very imaginative and quite innovative. But fundamentally, a lot of the technology can be quite mature, which is a good thing, which means we can implement it relatively quickly. And as you say, see those results. Well, look, fascinating talking to you again. We've actually gone over time on this one. I think I have to apologise. I think it's the first time we've actually gone over time on the Bits and Bytes Live. Try and keep them to a few minutes shorter than this one. But hopefully that's been fun. Thank you again for joining us, Lorcan, as ever. I look forward to the next time you join us, talking on probably a different topic. I don't know. I think we'll be coming back to sustainability once or twice.
I think so. We can afford to do that. I think so.
Yeah, I think we've got a few other topics lined up as well for folks over the coming weeks. But for now, thank you very much. Thanks again, Lorcan. Thanks, people, for listening. Appreciate it.